Hello, everybody. So welcome, everybody. We want to let you know that we are recording today's session, but it's being recorded um, with only our faces showing, so you'll all be anonymous as attendees. And we really want to thank you all for attending today. We're going to be using this video later on our YouTube channel. We'll be only showing our panelists' faces and names, and all questions will be anonymous, so please put them in the Q&A box so that we retain them throughout the presentation. And you're welcome to enter those at any time. So I want to tell you a little bit. We're here at EWGI. We seek to research and educate and organize to build a broad-based movement that dismantles the social, economic, and environmental dangers that are posed by excessive wealth. Polling shows that Americans have a tangible appetite for taxing the rich, but we see in our election results and in efforts to pass progressive tax policies that we as a movement are falling short and that we're not bringing enough people both to the table and to action. Advocates often speak in language and messages that may mobilize people who already feel the same way that we do, but those messages also often alienate the people we need to bring with us. We know that many of you are speaking to people with a variety of viewpoints on the issue of economies and taxation as well as wealth. And it's our hope that sharing insights from this project will help give you new directions to explore with persuadable people in your constituencies. Now, right now, the ground for changing tax policy is not fertile. There's a real disconnect between popular opinion and policy making. 50 years of neoliberalism and austerity has scorched the earth, making it impossible for more equitable tax policy to take root. So it's our collective job to serve as gardeners and to create a more fertile environment for these seeds of discontent to grow into real policy change. I'd like to introduce to you the rest of the team that's going to be on our session today. So from our team at UWDI, we have Hiba Murray, our research lead. We have Porter McConnell, a consultant who's supporting us. And we have Julia Liao from Wonder for Good, which is a team of experts in messaging, storytelling, psychology, and audience research. They use audience insights to develop storytelling and messaging strategies that shape attitudes and influence the behavior of key audiences on the most emotionally complex social issues that we face. And we had the great pleasure of working with Wonder on this research project. They were our key partner in producing this research. And now, Julia, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. Thank you all for being with us today. Wonder was really honored to partner with EWDI on this research project. And before we dive in today to the insights and the recommendations that we want to share from this research, I just want to talk a little bit about why this research project and why now. I love Jen's beautiful metaphor of us as gardeners, tilling the soil to make a more fertile environment for tax policy. And on this project specifically, this project started with polling results, quantitative polling results that already exist. So we started this work by reviewing over 50 national and state level polls from the last 5 years. And what we realized is that something is getting lost in translation when it comes to how Americans are actually voting. So many of the previous polls that we looked at actually showed majority support, sometimes even among Republicans, for various progressive tax reform proposals. But obviously, we all know that we're not seeing that support reflected in the policies and the candidates that people are voting for. So in other words, polling responses are not reflected in results at the ballot box. And so we set out to understand why that's happening, something that feels really critical at this time, at this moment in time. And to do that, we turn to a qualitative approach of deep audience listening, the kind that isn't always necessarily able to happen in polling surveys. So we kind of started with the quantitative data, and from that, we saw that we needed to move into a deep listening qualitative approach. And so that's the question that you can see on the slide that this project sought to answer is what is happening at the ballot box when it comes time for Americans to vote for policymakers and policies that are going to move the needle on economic and tax policy. So to answer that question, we focused on a broad swath of people, but particularly those who lean ideologically moderate, but can be persuaded, who can come to support our policies, who can move over to our way of seeing things if we reach them with messaging that resonates with them. And what we did was in 2024, as I mentioned, we started with that audit of existing public opinion research and polling. We also conducted an audit of media coverage and social media on these topics. And then we did these really deep, in-depth qualitative interviews with audience members who we identified as persuadable, as well as focus groups with a similar audience. And throughout this process, we were guided by, of course, our close partnership with EWDI, but also input from an advisory committee throughout this process that included our partners at Groundwork Collaborative and We Make the Future. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to give you one quick example of some existing survey work out there that we looked at and found extremely compelling in guiding this project. So the work on this slide comes from Hadaway Communications and BME Community. And as you can see, they did research which identified a potential audience of 39 million Americans who vote, volunteer, donate. They support the ideals of racial equality and social justice and fairness, but they're turned off by the way that we as progressives sometimes express our viewpoints in jargon, especially jargon that suggests that all systems are broken, that individuals are powerless, and that populations are defined by their challenges. So BME Community dubbed this group of 39 million Americans builders, and they span the political spectrum. 51% of them are Democrats, 22% are independents, and 20% are Republicans. Builders can sometimes show up as invisible for progressive activists or they get mislabeled as disengaged because they don't respond to progressive appeals. But what they do respond is to narratives that define people by their aspirations, that replace jargon and fear triggering with common language and inspiration that resonates with their everyday lives, and that holds opponents in America accountable without necessarily going deep into vilifying either. So just to drive this point home and how important this group of Americans can be, the size of this group overall, 39 million, is 14 times the margin of victory in the 2024 presidential race. And if you look at just the 20% of builders who are Republicans, that's 7.8 million people, that's 3 times the margin of victory in the 2024 race alone. So we set out to understand how can we reach this group of Americans on tax reform and addressing excessive wealth contribution. So with that stage setting, I'm going to turn it over to the EWDI team to tell you what we found. And what I want to share with you all in attendance is that a core part of our approach at Wonder is that we conduct research in very close collaboration with our partners and project advisors who are actually working in the field. We want our recommendations to be actionable and not sit on a shelf. So that also means ensuring that those in the field understand these findings so that they can use them and also share them with others. And so I've asked the EWDI team to present today to demonstrate that approach in action. So over to you, Hiba.
Thanks, Julia. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who exactly our research audience was. So as you can see, we had a relatively diverse group. We had about a 50-50 split between male-female and a whole host of age ranges. We purposely oversampled Black folks, and we had a mix of different political ideologies and political parties. So you can see 37% of people identified as liberal, 46% moderate, and 17% conservative. As Julia mentioned, all of these folks were recruited because they had moderate views on a number of statements related to billionaires, the American economy, and taxes. And these were the folks that participated in the 20 one-on-one in-depth interviews, as well as 2 focus groups. So we had 15 focus group participants total. A few more demographic details here. We asked folks to describe their financial situation. So you'll see that a lot of people put themselves in the 2 categories of just getting by financially or financially secure and stable, but not wealthy. You can also see that these responses came from a whole different range of incomes. So it's really important to note that income doesn't always indicate how people feel about their financial situation. And then another thing that I would note here is just where folks lived. So, in terms of the rural urban spectrum, we were really mindful of wanting to get some rural small town representation, and we were able to do that. Okay, so we know everyone really is interested in the recommendations. So I'm going to talk a bit about the highlights of the project. So here are the messages that were effective for persuadable audiences, and on the other hand, some messages that didn't really work or might cause backlash with the same persuadable audience. So the first thing that really works is keeping the focus on them, aka keeping the focus on working people and families as drivers of the economy. We also saw that it works well to stick to a strategically neutral tone. So that means curated details and facts to present both sides of a situation. For example, we tested content that included the bipartisan history of tax cuts for the wealthy, and also content that included the idea that trickle-down economics is a contrasting model from one that centers working people. And both of those really helped to move our audience to being more receptive and excited about progressive tax policy. The third thing to highlight in terms of what worked is that there's a lot of appetite for simplifying the tax system. So people really understand intuitively this idea that we should eliminate loopholes that allow some people to pay really low taxes. We also learned a lot about messengers, and we found that messengers who can demonstrate some level of credibility in the financial system, as well as wholesome motivations for speaking about it, were the most trusted by our audiences. So, for example, faith leaders and financial literacy educators were some of the most trusted messengers. And then lastly, on the what works yellow section, helping manage the audience's own discomfort around their finances and move them to a place of agency within what they consider to be a broken system is really, really key. In terms of what doesn't work with this persuadable audiences, there's a few things that really turn people off. So firstly, framing progressive taxes as a punishment for wealthy folks didn't work with this audience. Another thing that made people disengage really quickly was using language or tone that was heavily partisan or skewed, as well as categorically villainizing the wealthy just for having wealth. So people are really kind of aware when something feels partisan to them. The third one on the what didn't work side came as a surprise to us and our team. So we thought that it might be interesting to share how big the wealth gap is and the power differential between the wealthy and other people, that we thought that might motivate people, but it actually made them feel powerless and it made them disengaged. So at least for a persuadable audience, we don't recommend that. And then lastly, on the what didn't work is emphasizing what progressive tax policy could pay for as the main point of your messaging. So the reason for this is that folks think that government is inefficient, so they're really hesitant to support progressive taxes just for the reason of it being able to pay for different things. So now that you have a sense of the project's main findings, I'm going to turn it back over to Julia to talk a little bit about the narrative landscape.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hiba. So one thing that we did at the start of this project was that, as I mentioned on a previous slide, we conducted what we call a landscape scan of current news media coverage and social media posts about topics like wealth, billionaires, and the economy that felt relevant to this project. And so what you're seeing here on this slide may actually also help explain some of the recommendations of what worked and what didn't that Hiba mentioned on the previous slide, because what we saw is that there are these two prominent narratives in the news and on social media when it comes to wealth, billionaires, and the economy. And what we heard in our audience interviews and focus groups is that both of these narratives are very much influencing the thinking of persuadable audiences. One thing that's really interesting is that these two themes, which I'll voice over in a moment, are actually not mutually exclusive for our audience. So I want to say that again, because for us, we might look at these two narratives and say, oh, these are sort of two narratives on either end of a spectrum, and you can fall somewhere on that spectrum. But actually, for our audiences, many of them, at least for those who are persuadable, many of them are holding versions of both of these narratives in their minds at the same time. And that explains a lot of what we saw, both in the recommendations of what worked and what didn't work, and then in what EWDI team will share with you next, going deeper into audience mindset. So the first narrative that we saw is this idea of trapped in a broken system. This is a summary you can see on the slide, phrased from the perspective of how the audience experiences this narrative. So what they're hearing is the rich just keep getting richer. It's unfair that the rich get to take advantage of loopholes, harm the climate, degrade our democracy with no consequences, while the rest of us struggle to pay for basic necessities and the wealth gap widens. But the key thing about the trapped in a broken system narrative is this feeling of helplessness. We need drastic change, but I don't see how that can ever happen. And that feeling of helplessness traps our audiences in a place where they just don't believe in any solution that they might vote for, or might have the option to vote for. And so it doesn't drive them to action in the way that we would like to see. The other narrative on the other side of the slide is billionaires embody the possibility of the American dream. So what our audiences are hearing and internalizing is that we should aspire to be like billionaires. We can all follow their example to improve our own circumstances and achieve the American dream. And if we take away billionaires' freedom to earn and keep as much money as possible, that means taking that freedom away from everyone, which would hurt all of us because the rich also contribute to our economy and spur innovation. So one way that we saw our persuadable audiences holding both of these narratives in their mind at the same time is that they believe that they're trapped in a broken system, that we're trapped in a broken system. And so for them, the only way out that they see for themselves and their families and their loved ones to have a better life is then to aspire to be more wealthy, to be like a billionaire, to put in the hard work that they need so that their families and themselves will be more financially well off. And if that's their aspiration, to be like a billionaire, then they have negative feelings about any policy that we might propose that could be seen by them as limiting billionaires' freedom and potentially their freedom in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hiba or Jen, someone from EWDI, who's going to share a little bit more about our audience's mindsets.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. So a few things about our audience. These are really kind of overview findings, and then I'm going to go ahead and share with you some quotes so that you can hear what these sound like in their own words. So firstly, this audience's feelings of agency are often tied to deeply held identities. So like being a hard worker, educating themselves, taking care of their families, protecting their families, identities like that. The second key thing to note about our audience is that they do understand the harms of having too much wealth, like wealth buying you power in the political system, and they do want to see a more balanced system. But they also have concerns about increasing taxes on billionaires because they perceive that billionaires have worked hard and earned their wealth. So they don't want to be taking that away and being seen as unfair. So that's a challenge for us in this work. Third is that when it comes to tax rates, the audience wants the system to be fair, but they have really different varying definitions of what fair means. So some folks felt that a flat tax rate was fair, while other people understood that if you have more, you should contribute more, and that's fair. And then lastly, maybe particularly important for our attendees today, this audience held a distrust in government and institutions. They believed that government is inefficient, and they really had an extreme wariness of partisanship or anything that felt biased or skewed or like it had an agenda. And so people were really sensitive to anything that was like obviously trying to message to them, and they were very skeptical about that. So like I said, now we're going to take a look at what this actually looks like in the words of the participants. So the first one, this is a quote about the first finding around audience members feeling agency, which are drawn from their identities. So I think in the future I could become wealthy. I really believe that. I know that if you have a goal and you put your money toward it and you work hard, you'll achieve it. I want people to picture me when they say billionaire. And this is a Black woman, moderate Democrat from New York, 35 years old. And then the second, when I think about billionaires, it's an image of aspiration. What would I need to do to attain something like that? Have I been perceptive or resourceful enough to get along that path? So this was a white man, Republican, moderate, 58 years old from Pennsylvania. So we can see here that folks really believe it's possible that they too could become billionaires, even though that's like very statistically rare. So that's why when we talk about taxing billionaires, they're really including themselves in that. And again, these are people across a range of incomes, like we saw in the demographic slide earlier, and some of them self-assessed mismatched to their income. So that's super interesting. And again, this makes sense. Like if you think back to trapped in a broken system, people are looking for agency in a place that might feel hopeless to them. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the second finding. So this is about audiences understanding the harms of wealth, but being concerned about taxes as a punitive measure. And I'm gonna go ahead and ask Jen to read these quotes so that we can have some variation.
Sure, thanks, Eva. So the first quote, I agree with the fact that the wealth gap is increasing, and I also agree that billionaires and rich corporations need to pay more taxes. But what I do not agree with is the tone of the messages that sound like somehow from a place of hatred. It's like, we are not happy that you are billionaires, so hence they need to pay more taxes. That should not be the mindset. This is from a Black man, an independent, somewhat liberal, 28 years old from Illinois. And then if an individual has accumulated wealth, they work for that. They should get to keep it. They should get to prosper and make their own choices for their family and their household. And that's from a Black woman, independent, moderate, 35 years old from Minnesota.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, this really captures people's ability to hold the tension that they want the system to be fair, but they're also really sensitive to billionaires being categorically villainized. And they reject the idea of taxing billionaires as a punishment just because that they're rich. Okay, so moving on to the third key finding about our audience, this one was that the audience wants a fair tax system, but they have really different definitions of what fair means. So in their own words, I just believe that we're all people, we're all earning money, we should be taxed in a similar way. It shouldn't matter what kind of job or how much money we actually put in. That sounds fair to me. This was a Hispanic woman, Republican, very conservative, 52 from California. So again, with this audience, they really don't define fair the same way that we might define fair. And then lastly, the fourth finding is about distrust in government. I'm going to go ahead and ask Jen to read again.
Lowering the tax rate, assuming the trickle-down effect, we don't know how effective that really is for helping the economy. But raising the tax rate, we are assuming that the government is going to get more money to have programs, but are we sure those programs are really going to be well funded? So to me, it's a catch-22. Does either option really work? Black man, Democrat, moderate, 35 years old from Georgia. I don't believe in your typical stereotype of big bad billionaires are evil. I think that it's just very skewed. I don't think everything is all bad and everything is all good. East Asian woman, Democrat, moderate, 37 years old from California.
Awesome, thanks. So you can see in their own words, the audience is really sensitive to any biased tone that extends to rejecting messages that they feel are overly inflammatory or any kind of one-sided view against billionaires. Okay, so for those of you that are numbers inclined, we found remarkable movement after we tested our messages. So essentially what you're seeing here is that people who thought that billionaires whose income doesn't come from work should be taxed at the same rate as somebody making $60,000 a year. After they heard our test messaging, they felt that those billionaires should be taxed at a higher rate than somebody making $60,000 a year. Again, we have this illustrated in their own words. So before messaging, this person said, I do believe billionaires are innovators. If you think about the wealthiest Americans, like Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, they don't just get wealthy. If you have wealth, you can do whatever you want, but these people decided to create something. I believe we're all better off because Microsoft exists, because Amazon exists, because Tesla, SpaceX exists. Without these billionaires, this stuff wouldn't exist. And then after messaging interventions, the same person said, I think if you have more wealth, then you have more to give. I think that if you've been blessed by God, society, whoever has it, that you've been given much, that you have a responsibility to give back to your community that has given so much to you. Someone who has 50 million should be contributing a lot more to society, both as a monetary amount and as a percentage than someone making 50,000. If you have 50 million and you end up giving the government 20 million, you still have 30 million, and that's at a 40% tax rate. And this was a white man, Republican, somewhat conservative, 34 from Colorado. So now that I've talked a whole lot about the messaging and the project, I'm going to hand it off to Jen to talk about potential directions to drive support.
Thanks, Hiba. So I know you can't probably see a lot of these quotes. That's okay. We're going to share with you our report that has a lot of this information in it after the session, as well as the slides. But we found some directions that are really helpful for moving people towards support. One of those is, as we said at the beginning, occupying the strategically neutral middle ground. So this is not necessarily saying this is what I believe because of this, but just presenting facts. We use some neutral FAQs, asking people about history, giving people information, and allowing them to draw their own conclusions from that. We found that using quote unquote good millionaires as effective messengers, so folks that are speaking out, calling on higher taxes for the rich themselves, who are in that group, were particularly good messengers. We feel like there's a real value in using other people as validators. So for instance, working with community economic developers to be people who can speak specifically to tax policy. Folks who are teaching financial literacy classes. It was a very resonant piece of information with our test population, as well as amplifying the stories of faith-based messengers that really resonated. And that's true in a lot of social issues. And so it's interesting that that resonated over into tax policy, which I think of as a little bit more fact-based, but the faith-based messengers really resonated there as well. And then finally, sharing stories of collective action, of places where people came together and they were able to make change collaboratively. That I think helps people get out of this, like the whole system is rigged and there's nothing I can do, and move into like there's a potential for us together to make change. I'm going to hand over to Julia to share what comes next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hiba and Jen. So what does all of this mean, right? What do we want you to take away from this? Persuadable audiences, we have learned, are very capable of connecting the dots on tax reform and addressing excessive wealth concentration if we guide them with the right messaging. And I think also one important thing that we learned in this research is that messaging that works for the base does have the potential to turn off or push away persuadable audiences, especially if those audiences feel like it's particularly partisan or skewed. So some of the messaging that we might use that does work for our base around villainizing billionaires or talking about how our tax system is just completely broken, that might work for the base and drive them to action, but it may mean that we lose some of the persuadable audiences that we also need to come along with us to start winning at the ballot box. So these on this slide are some of the areas for further exploration that we'd love to see happen with this work. And if anyone who's attending is interested in learning more or being involved, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk. But at the beginning of this presentation, I talked a little bit about how we started this project with the quantitative research, the polling and the surveys that had already happened. And what we learned from those was that we needed to do a little bit of a qualitative deeper dive to understand why that polling wasn't matching up with how people actually vote. Now that we have those qualitative results, we love to go back out at scale to the quantitative research, larger sample research at scale for further testing of our recommendations with a broader audience, particularly with some audience demographics that we're very interested in doing further follow-up with, including communities of color who were included in this qualitative work. We're also very interested in reaching, in further understanding how our messages can reach and change the hearts and minds of men, particularly Latinx men. And then, as Jen mentioned on the previous slide, we're also very interested in this piece around faith audiences and doing further work around how we can reach them. We also know, of course, that especially in this moment, we really need to scale this work up. We would love to see scaled up messenger and storytelling campaigns that can really reach Americans and help to shift the public opinion and public narratives on the economy, wealth, and taxes, using what we've learned in this research about how we can do that with persuadable audiences. We want to continue building our network. So a model that Wonder has used on other important topics such as immigration justice, as well as other economic justice work that we've done, is what we call train the trainer, where we train cohorts of leaders within the movement who can embed the messaging that we've learned about in their work, but also help spread that messaging to others who are doing work in economic justice, who are doing work in advocacy. And again, you kind of got a taste of that through EWDI's presentation. They've really been an exemplary example of a partner that has worked with us and really taken what we've learned and internalized it in their own work and can now share it with others. And then, of course, we know that in building our network, it's also important to resource our network, resource leaders and organizations to do the long-term work of narrative change. I think we learned a lot of exciting things in this research about what can move the needle, and we know that narratives don't change overnight. So our movement really does need to put in that sustained investment and commitment to that long-term narrative change so that we can eventually build an economy that actually works for everyone. We also want to continue to provide our knowledge resources for the movement in an ongoing basis. So doing regular briefings, toolkits, rapid response guidance for organizations and policymakers to put these findings to use. And then again, one of the takeaways that we hope you all take from this research and can share with others as well is the importance of knowing your audience and target clearly. One of the things that really stood out to us from this research is that it's really important that moving forward, we make clearer distinctions between when we're doing base building and when we're trying to move persuasion audiences over onto our side. Sometimes hot language that works at the base doesn't necessarily work with persuadable audiences, or it actually pushes them away. And that importance of providing messages that resonate with persuadable audiences and then help them connect the dots can actually be very effective. So we really can make lasting change through that strategy. So just to conclude on this, we really think that the moment is now to be reaching persuadable audiences on the issue of wealth inequality, wealth hoarding, tax reform, because we see how much opportunity there is. We see in this research that we can actually reach them. And we see from other research, like the 39 million Americans who BME Community defined as builders, that we really can move the needle if we're able to reach that really large group of Americans. So with that said, thank you all, and I think I'm turning it over to Porter.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Heather. Thanks, Jen. I have the very exciting task of getting feedback from you guys. We have some great questions in the Q&A already, but just to encourage you to drop any questions in. Remember, they'll be anonymous, and there's no such thing as a dumb question. First one, I wanted to flag, which is a great one, is many of you will be aware that the New Dems just released not too long ago a tax platform. And I know this is very much about messaging, but how does it relate to that sort of policy effort? Is that a question maybe, Jen, you want to take?
Yeah, I think that's going to be most in my wheelhouse. So I hope that you've taken away from this that our project is really to look at moving persuadable audiences to support both taxing corporations and the extremely wealthy. And unfortunately, the New Dems proposal, it just really generally preserves that deep complexity of the tax code It doesn't streamline, it doesn't give you clear rates. It still leaves a lot of those loopholes in there that allow corporations and the super rich to pay less. So one of our central messages that it's, one of the things that resonates with this audience is that it makes sense to streamline and simplify the tax system. It's just not addressed in the New Dems proposal at all. And it's also probably worth noting that, that we might need a different approach to get to that same place for folks, because the support for taxing the rich and taxing corporations is really quite strong. We have a whole research study about that that we did last year. You can find it on EWDI's website, or we can send the link out with our follow-up messaging. We did a whole meta-analysis of polls, and then just this year in March, Pew reported that 6 in 10 US adults believe that taxes should be raised on large businesses and on corporations and households earning more than 400,000 a year. And within that, it's like 75% of Democrats and independents and like 20 or like 40% of Republicans really feel that people are not paying their fair share in taxes. So voters they're not clamoring for, IP tax breaks or for more deductions on corporate taxes. The pass through, we've certainly heard a lot about that. And it's really hard to see how the New Dems proposal is an effective response to this public sentiment on taxes from either the base or from persuadable audiences. So I just don't really see it being something that, addresses these root challenges. It kind of nibbles around the edges. Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Jen. That's great. We have another great question. Do you mind providing more details or maybe more examples about the tested content that have the audience more inclined to progressive tax policy?
Can jump in on that one. So one thing I want to just note for you all is that we do actually have a full-length messaging guide on all of this research, and that messaging guide actually does include those examples of the actual tested messaging, along with annotations about what worked well, what worked particularly well, what maybe didn't work as well. So I think that's definitely something that we'll share out and you all will have access to in the follow-up as well. But I can just briefly voice over a few examples of the messaging that tested particularly well. One was sort of, again, you've heard us use this term a few times, a strategically neutral, frequently asked question, sort of a one-pager that we put together and showed audiences. And again, we say strategically neutral because we sort of made an effort to have audiences see that we represented both sides of the tax debate in that FAQ. And yet it's strategic in the sense that obviously we were using statistics, we were including messaging that would sort of help them come to the conclusion that the current tax reform or the current tax code is not working for working Americans and families like themselves. I think one important thing to note about the power of a strategically neutral message like that is that it helps audiences feel like they're looking at the issue, they're getting information about the issue, and they're coming to their own conclusion. So that piece is something that we see at Wonder over and over on this topic, on other topics, on other social issues that we work on, that where audiences really push back on messaging or react negatively to messaging is when they feel like the message is telling them what they should feel or what they should think. And what they really value is having the information. Again, our FAQ was still designed to sort of funnel them to the conclusion. We used some statistics like the ones that Hiba and Jen mentioned throughout their presentation, like some statistics about how what a working class family pays in taxes compared to the effective tax rate for billionaires and millionaires. So we use statistics like that to funnel them to the conclusion that we want them to reach. But at the end of the day, we're letting them come to their own conclusion by giving them the information. And that is something that really resonates with our audiences. So that's one piece that really worked, is the strategically neutral FAQ. And then another piece that we saw that really resonated, that kind of surprised us, but in a good way, was this letter to the editor from a financial literacy teacher. So from someone who was sort of writing about how she helps to increase financial literacy for working people and families in her community and how she's seeing that our current tax code is not working for them. One interesting thing we learned in this research project is that a lot of times audiences have kind of negative emotions associated with talking about the tax code or the financial system because it is very complicated. And so they feel kind of overwhelmed. I will never have the knowledge that I need to understand how our financial and economic system works, or even I have some shame or guilt or other negative feelings around my own financial situation. And that was something really interesting that we learned. And what we learned was that having someone who has expertise in that area, who is able to sort of validate and say, yeah, from the work I do, I see how complicated our tax code is, and I see how it's not working for working class Americans, was really powerful, really resonated with people. They related to that messenger and then were open to her message about tax reform. So those are a couple examples. There are more in the full messaging guide that we'll share. Of course, happy to take follow-up questions on any of that too. Just drop them in the Q&A.
There's so much to unpack there. Thank you so much, Julia.
Before we move on, I just want to add that one of the things that really surprised me about the findings was that actually explaining the scale of like million and billion really shut people down. Because I feel like that was one that for me, I was like, oh, people just don't understand the scope of wealth and what we're talking about. It's not even 1 billion, but it's billions and billions of dollars. And if they really understood, they would understand we're not saying make everyone be broke. We're saying like there should be a cap on there. And that really didn't work with people at all. It just kind of pushed them into this, you know, from this sort of like hopeful mindset, but into the whole system is rigged and what's the point. So yeah, just sharing that because I think it's one that's worth underlining.
And that was, I think that is a hard message to hear for those of us whose nightmares are made of this stuff, right? Who want to share the panic, you know? It's sort of like, well, but it, you know, you should know just how bad it is. I remember, and maybe Julia, you can speak to this, but there was an effective tax rate stat, or I think maybe Hiba, you mentioned this, that we were using, and there were a couple in play, and both were, you know, valid. But the higher one, the lower one was too unbelievable for people to assimilate, and so you ended up changing to the slightly higher one.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That we tested two different ways of looking at the numbers and framing them. And when the disparity was too big between those who are wealthiest and again working Americans and families, people just said, I can't believe that's possible. I feel like you're giving me information that has been manipulated in some way. And so we had to actually find a way of framing the information that retained the believability of that gap, so that people would actually say, okay, that's pretty not good, but I believe that that's the case. So let me do something about it.
Mm-hmm. So just to sort of remind us that, you know, that not all campaigning and messaging is a group therapy, that sort of that you know, that we need to do that work. And then also a related message, just sort of taking moderator's prerogative. If you guys could speak a little bit more about the distinction between how to message the base and how to message persuadables, I think that would be helpful, because I know that, you know, when you're sort of busy policy staff, it's not always, sometimes can be hard to target, you know, to hold two different sets of messages at the same time. So maybe if you can speak a little bit about, like, you know, that this is for this crowd, but there's other stuff for other crowds.
I'm happy to start off and then would love Hiba and Jen to add as well. But one thing I would say is that we, you know, given that we didn't specifically test base audiences in this research, we still believe, we hypothesize that many of the recommendations that work for persuadable audiences actually would resonate for base audiences too. And that aligns with what we've seen in other research that we've done, other projects that we've done. So things like keeping the focus on working people and families rather than making the message about billionaires and all the bad deeds that they do, actually bringing the message back to something that the audience can relate to, whether they're the base or persuadables, which is the focus on themselves as working people and families. And then some of these other pieces of guidance, like using a strategically neutral tone so the audience can reach their own conclusion, using these ideas like simplifying the tax system and eliminating loopholes, which are very widely supported. We actually think that that would resonate very well with the base as well. So that would sort of be our guidance, at least at this stage of the work. And I think, really what we learned, as I mentioned earlier, is that some of the base messaging that really leans into villainization, that really leans into billionaires are behaving badly, that really leans into, as we've been talking about, the extent of the wealth gap or the power gap. Some of that base messaging may not work for persuadable audiences. So using that sort of more broadly risks losing some of our folks. Hiba and Jen may have more to add also from some of the work that other partners have done.
Yeah, I think they're well known in the space, but for folks that are looking specifically more for base messaging, We Make the Future is a group that really does a lot of like trainings and puts out a lot of recommendations around the race class narrative. And they also have more like region specific work. So I would recommend checking them out if that's what you're looking for.
Thank you, Hiba, and thank you, Julia. One additional question I'm seeing that I think you sort of touched on, but maybe if you could do a little bit more about, is the difficulty of generalizing from this small sample size, and the need for sort of quantitative follow-ups. I know you mentioned that you started with the quantitative work, but if you can sort of hone in on that a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thanks so much, Porter. That's a great question. So really just to drive the point home, the benefit of deep listening qualitative research like this is that we can do a deeper dive and more unpacking into that contradiction that I mentioned that we were previously seeing between the quantitative polling results and the ballot box results. That sort of deep listening approach often does involve a slightly smaller sample size in order to be able to do that level of qualitative work. So as I mentioned, one thing that we really hope to do is to be able to do further quantitative work to follow up on our findings with a broader and further test our messaging with folks like those 39 million American builders. But the other thing that I really want to note is that something that really struck us in this project is that from the 35 persuadable audience members who were part of our focus groups and our interviews, we really saw extremely consistent responses from them. Even though, sometimes with a smaller N, you might expect to see a little bit more variability. And even though, as you might remember from the demographic slide that Hiba presented, we really did recruit this group of folks to represent different demographics. Racially, we represented, I think, 15 different states among these folks that we interviewed. We looked at, we recruited folks both from rural areas as well as more urban areas. We had a little bit of a span across household income. And so there really was quite a diversity of demographics among the folks included in this study. And yet we really, really saw consistent responses from what they said, and a lot of the same themes and a lot of the recommendations and the audience insights that we presented today are really things that just kept coming up among this audience. And so we think that's really striking and says a lot about just the importance of taking what we're starting to learn from this deep qualitative research, both looking at it at a larger scale, but also taking what we're starting to learn and saying, okay, we know enough now to start getting messaging out into the field that's really going to hopefully reach these persuadable audiences, because we're hearing the same things from them over and over again. And so we're really starting to get a sense of how we might better reach them. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Julia. That a lot of these assumptions sit on a very large N of quantitative work over decades. And in some ways, I think we will never put y'all out of business, because you've been telling us the same thing for a very long time. People are not actually all that different across regions and across political persuasions. In any case, I'm going to turn it over to Jen to close us out after this fascinating presentation.
Great. First, I just want to thank everybody for giving us your time today. We're really excited to see how things move forward in the future. So yeah, feel free to share your info with us. And yeah, we really look forward to seeing how you harness this urgency of this moment that we're in right now. We are going to be following up with everyone who attended today with materials that we hope will help you in thinking about how you can use this. And again, our messaging guide does have more detail about different specific messages that were tested and how they were used, so you can dig more deeply into that. And we just really hope that we've inspired you to continue the discussion. And I want to thank on behalf of EWDI, we had a team of advisors who provided really critical input to shaping this research. In particular, Abigail Stahl, who is formerly of Groundwork Collaborative and provided support in her role there, and Anika Fascia, who's the co-ED of We Make the Future. We had fantastic co-conspirators in this project and the team from Wonderful Strategies for Good. So Julia, who you've seen here on this presentation, and her colleagues, Alicia and Ian, you all were an absolute dream to work with, and I just really couldn't have done it without you. And EWDI's fantastic staff, including our ED, Gabriela Sandoval, Patricia Arroyos, and Hiba Murray. And yeah, so thanks to everybody. We'll wrap it up there.